All right, so today we're going back in time a bit, taking a deep dive into the lives of Indian women living in colonial Guyana.
Fascinating period. We're going to be looking at this 2023 chapter from Kalapani, Studies on South Asian Diaspora.
Okay, and what makes this source stand out? What should we be paying attention to?
Well, it's not just the usual story. You see, it uses a lot of colonial records, like really digs into
I
them.
like that, digging into the archives. Always find something new there.
Exactly. And it challenges, kind of pushes back on some of the common narratives we have about, indentureship.
Right, indentureship.
Yeah.
Just to set the scene for our listeners, we're talking about British Guiana post-slavery abolition.
Right. After they abolished slavery.
Plantations needed workers, obviously.
Desperately.
And that's where the indenture system comes in, right?
Mhm.
Bringing in all these laborers from South Asia.
Huge numbers. Over 238,000, if you can imagine.
Wow. I mean, it's mind-boggling. And I've always wondered about the women, especially in those early days.
Right.
There's this idea that because there were so few of them, they held a bit more power. Is that true, or?
It's tricky. I mean, yeah, that shortage definitely created some interesting dynamics, you could say.
Interesting in what way?
Well, you had these situations. But we have to remember the bigger picture. These women were still trapped in a system designed to control them. It's not like they were suddenly in charge.
Right, of course.
Yeah.
So who were these women? Before Guyana, I mean. What were their lives back in India like?
It varied, of course. I mean, India's
Yeah.
massive, right? But a lot of them were lower caste or widows facing pretty grim prospects back home.
So the indenture system, it wasn't just about finding a better life, it was.
More like escaping a bad one, often. This chapter, it actually talks about one woman, Maharani. She was tricked, completely misled.
Oh, man.
They promised her work, said she'd be sifting sugar, earning a decent wage. Totally different story once she arrived.
Oh, man. And the journey itself, those voyages were brutal.
Months at sea, terrible conditions.
That's imagining it.
There's this one case study. The ship was called the Salset. A third of the passengers died on the way from Calcutta to Trinidad. Disease, not enough food, barely any care.
And for women, especially traveling with kids, that must have been.
Unimaginable. This source, it actually quotes from a ship's log, talking about infants dying because, lack of milk, mothers dying, and then their kids soon after, just nobody to look after them. Awful.
It's heartbreaking. And to think surviving that journey was only the first hurdle. Then they had to face life on the plantations.
Exactly. A whole other set of challenges awaited them.
So paint a picture for us. What was daily life like for these women once they arrived in Guyana and started working on the plantations?
Grueling is the word that comes to mind. Back-breaking labor, long hours, and for what? Pitiful wages. All under the watchful eye of, the European overseers.
Right, the overseers. But it wasn't just them calling the shots, was it?
No, not at all. Like we were saying earlier, fewer Indian women initially. That created this weird power dynamic, even within their own community.
So they had to deal with exploitation from
Multiple directions, unfortunately, and made them even more vulnerable.
So even within the system of indentureship, there were these other layers of power dynamics at play.
Absolutely. And as more Indian women started arriving, it shifted things again. New challenges emerged.
Okay, so how did things change as more women arrived? What happened?
You saw a strengthening of traditional South Asian family structures, and a stricter enforcement of those social norms they brought with them, all within this colonial system that was already designed to control them, of course.
Ah, so it's almost like this double-edged sword. More women arrive, which could mean more support, but it also leads to...
A tightening of those traditional expectations, exactly.
Yeah. And I imagine increased tensions.
Oh, absolutely. And sadly, in many cases, it led to violence.
Yeah, the chapter doesn't shy away from that aspect, does it?
No, it doesn't. It confronts it head on. And I think that's important because we need to understand what was driving that violence.
Right. It's not enough to just acknowledge it happened. We need to understand the why.
Exactly. And it's complicated, as you can imagine. You've got this skewed sex ratio, the power dynamics within the community itself, cultural clashes. And then you add in the inherent brutality of the plantation system. It's a recipe for, well...
For disaster.
Yeah.
But it's easy to slip into this narrative where these women are just victims, right? But, I mean, reading this chapter, it's clear they were far from passive. They fought back.
Oh, absolutely. And what's striking is how they resisted. Sometimes it was very direct, like outright rebellion against the plantation owners.
Joining uprisings, things like
Yeah,
that.
exactly. But then there were these smaller acts of defiance, too. Everyday things they did to chip away at the system from within.
Can you give us some examples? What kind of everyday resistance are we talking about?
Well, they formed alliances, created these networks of support amongst themselves, found ways to assert their agency in a world that was constantly trying to deny it. Small acts, but they made a difference.
It's a testament to their strength and resilience. I mean, facing all that, it would be easy to just, I don't know, give up. But they didn't. They actively fought back both as individuals and as a community. And that was all just within the context of the plantations.
Right, just one part of their story.
So what happened as families started moving off the plantations, establishing themselves in villages? Was that a turning point for these women?
You could say it was a new chapter for them, for sure, a shift in the power dynamics, but not always in the ways you might expect. So as more families moved into those villages, women's labor, it became like essential, right, to the whole East Indian community's success.
Yeah, I can see that. Their work was always vital, but in a village setting, did that change their roles at all? Within the community, I mean.
It's interesting, right? Because on one hand, yeah, their economic contributions, they were more important than ever. But then
Again,
it kind of reinforced those traditional roles, too.
yeah.
If you think about it, the chapter talks about how men still often controlled the finances. And women, they face these really limited options if they didn't follow those social norms, expectations around marriage, family, all that. It's almost like their economic power, it was recognized, but only up to a point, only within those very specific boundaries.
It's that same old story, isn't it? Progress, but on someone else's terms. And there's this part in the chapter, I can't remember if it was a quote or anyway, it mentions a colonial official, Mr. Young, I think.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
He was talking about Indian women, how they were making bank deposits, even sending money back to India, right?
Yeah, he was pretty impressed by that, wasn't he?
Exactly. Seemed to think it proved how empowered they were.
You'd think so, right? Based on that alone. But then he goes on about their moral status, how it needed improving, like their financial independence didn't quite make up for, I don't know, not fitting his idea of what a woman should be, I guess.
It's so transparent, isn't it? This need to qualify any sign of progress with some kind of dot critique or whatever. Like, they couldn't just be successful women. It had to be dot complicated somehow.
Exactly. And it highlights this really uncomfortable truth about that time, how colonialism and patriarchy, they kind of work together, But there's another aspect to this, something I found really interesting, this whole Brahminization thing they talk about.
Brahminization. Okay. Yeah, now you're getting into the good stuff. Break that down for me. What is that?
Basically, imagine it like this. You've got all these immigrants from all over India, right? Different customs, different languages, even variations within Hinduism itself. So much diversity. And then
this Brahminization happens.
Exactly. It's like this pressure, this cultural homogenization, you could say, where there's this push towards the dominant North Indian upper caste practices.
So instead of celebrating all those different traditions, it's more like
everyone has to conform to one specific mold? Yeah, kind of like that. And you can imagine how that might impact women in particular.
Yeah, because often those more dominant traditions, they tend to be
more restrictive.
More patriarchal.
Yep, exactly. So it's like this double whammy, right? You're already dealing with the limitations imposed by colonialism, and then you've got these cultural shifts happening within the community itself, often pushing for even stricter social norms.
It's like being caught between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
But you mentioned earlier, all these immigrants, they came from different parts of India. Were there any traditions that offered a different perspective? Maybe something more egalitarian?
Oh, absolutely. The chapter talks about this, how Dalit and South Indian traditions, for example, they often had practices that were way more progressive, things like widow remarriage, greater female autonomy, things that challenged those stricter, more patriarchal norms.
So those traditions existed, but
they were often pushed aside, overshadowed by this whole Brahminization process. It's like this really tragic loss of cultural richness, and it had a very real impact on women's lives.
It's a reminder that culture isn't just this abstract thing. It has real consequences.
Yeah.
But amidst all of this, these women, they were also playing a role in shaping their own destinies, right? I mean, the fight for independence in Guyana, that was huge. Were these women involved in that?
Oh, absolutely. Big time. The chapter talks about some amazing women. Have you heard of Nellie Sudeen?
Nellie Sudeen.
Yeah,
oh, yeah.
yeah.
She was incredible. A real firebrand.
That's the one. A true trailblazer. This woman, she wasn't afraid of anything. She stood up to the colonial authorities, challenged the traditional gender roles within her own community. She fought for women's rights, spoke out against child labor, just fearless.
I love hearing about these women who just refused to be silent. They saw injustice and they called it out no matter the cost.
Exactly. And it wasn't just her, you know? Countless women contributed to the independence movement. Some were organizing protests. Others were providing essential support to families when their husbands were imprisoned for their activism.
Yeah.
They were the backbone of the movement in many ways.
So often, it's the women who keep things going, who hold communities together, even when everything seems to be falling apart. But did things change for them after independence? I mean, did their sacrifices lead to greater equality, greater recognition?
You'd hope so, right? But unfortunately, it's a sad reality that a lot of these women, they were marginalized even within the movements they helped build. They fought so hard, sacrificed so much, and then they were often excluded from leadership roles. Their concerns were ignored. It's like they helped win the battle, but the war for equality, that was far from over.
It's a reminder that freedom isn't some finish line you cross. It's an ongoing struggle, a constant fight against those deeply ingrained power structures, whatever form they take. But before we get into that, maybe we should pause and reflect on the lasting legacies of this whole period for Indian women in Guyana. What did we learn from this deep dive into their experiences? It's kind of like they fought for their nation's freedom, but their own liberation was incomplete, you know?
Yeah, and that's the really, I don't know, the thought-provoking part, right? This chapter really drives home this point. Just because indentureship ended, officially at least, back in 1917, that didn't mean those effects, especially for these women, just disappeared.
Right, like erasing a chalkboard. It's not that simple.
Nope, not at all. And the chapter, it uses these individual stories, these women's lives, to show how colonialism, patriarchy, economic exploitation, all those forces that were stacked against them, they didn't just vanish overnight.
Right, the legacy of those systems, it lingered.
Exactly. It's like this ripple effect. And this wasn't just some abstract thing, you know, happening on a societal level. This was about real limitations on these women's lives. Their ability to work, to earn a living, to choose who they married, even just to practice their own cultural traditions. All of that was impacted, shaped by this history.
It makes you think about how we teach history, right?
Yeah.
We often just hit the bullet points, the big events. But when you really dig into the individual stories, like we've done today, that's where you see the true cost, the long-lasting consequences.
And the complexities. I mean, I thought I knew a bit about indentureship going into this, but this chapter, it really opened my eyes to just how much more there is to it. It's not just labor history, it's gender history, it's cultural history, it's all intertwined.
It's about power, too. Who has it, who doesn't, and how people navigate those systems, even when those systems are designed to keep them down.
And that's where the resilience of these women shines through. You know, they were dealt an incredibly difficult hand, but they kept fighting, kept finding ways to make their own choices, to create space for themselves and their families. It's inspiring, really.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder, right? Because this deep dive, it focused on Guyana, but we've only just scratched the surface of this much bigger story.
Yeah.
What about Indian women in other parts of the diaspora?
Yeah.
How do their experiences compare? What similarities do we see? What differences?
Those are the questions that keep me up at night. Because every story, every community, it adds another layer to our understanding. It reminds us that history isn't linear. It's not confined to one place or one group of people. It's all connected. And the more we explore those connections, the richer our understanding becomes.
And that's what I love about these deep dives. You know, it's not about having all the answers. It's about asking the right questions. It's about challenging our assumptions, digging deeper, and being open to the unexpected.
Exactly. It's about embracing the complexity, the messiness of it all, because that's where the truth lies.
Well said. So to our listeners, as you continue to explore this fascinating and often overlooked history of Indian women in the diaspora, remember, approach these stories with curiosity, with empathy, and with a willingness to challenge what you think you know. Their stories have the power to broaden our perspectives, deepen our understanding of the past, and even inspire us to fight for a more just and equitable future.